My name is Caleb Vance, and this happened in western North Carolina, not far from the Appalachian Mountains. I was 29 at the time, recently divorced, burned out from work, and barely sleeping more than a few hours a night. After months of noise, court dates, and sitting in an empty apartment that no longer felt like mine, I decided to disappear somewhere quiet for a while. I found a small cabin rental online outside a place called Black Hollow. The photos showed thick woods, rolling hills, and a porch facing nothing but trees. It looked peaceful in a way that almost didn't seem real. The owner only emailed me once with directions and a keypad code. No small talk, no warnings, nothing unusual. The drive took nearly 6 hours from Charlotte. Once I left the highway, the roads narrowed into steep mountain curves lined with dense forest. Cell service faded fast. By the time I reached the last gas station before the mountain road, my GPS had already frozen twice. I stopped to grab snacks, bottled water, and firewood. The woman behind the register watched me in a way that felt less friendly and more curious. When I mentioned the cabin near Black Hollow, she paused for a second too long before asking whose property it was. I told her the owner's name. She nodded slowly, but didn't respond right away. Finally, she said, "People don't stay up there long." I assumed she meant the isolation or bad reception. I joked about needing peace and quiet. She didn't smile. She just handed me my receipt and told me to be careful driving after dark because deer cross those roads without warning. That should have been a normal conversation, but something about her tone stayed with me. It sounded less like advice and more like concern. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by thick woods on every side. It looked older than the photos showed. The porch sagged slightly, and moss covered parts of the roof. The clearing around it was bigger than I expected, but beyond that open space was nothing but trees packed tightly together. The silence stood out immediately. No traffic, no distant barking dogs, not even airplane noise overhead, just wind moving through leaves. Inside, the place was simple but clean. A couch, fireplace, small kitchen, and one bedroom with a window facing the backwoods. I unpacked, made coffee, and sat outside as the sky darkened. At sunset, fog drifted between the trees, thick enough to blur the edges of the forest. Once darkness settled, the tree line looked solid black, like a wall surrounding the cabin. I went inside and locked the door without thinking much about it. Around 10 that night, while reading on the couch, I heard a single knock from somewhere outside. It didn't sound close enough to be the front porch, more like wood hitting wood deeper in the trees. I ignored it at first, assuming a branch had fallen. Then it came again, slow, hollow, spaced far enough apart that it sounded deliberate. I muted the TV and listened. Nothing followed. Eventually I went to bed, though I couldn't fully relax. The bedroom window had no curtains, and the dark woods sat only a few yards away. I lay there, staring at the glass, half asleep, until sometime after midnight when I woke suddenly for no clear reason. The room felt different, too quiet. I looked toward the window and saw a shape near the tree line, tall, motionless. At first I thought it was part of a tree trunk, but something about its outline looked wrong. Human-shaped, watching the cabin. I sat upright, trying to focus. Then clouds shifted overhead. Moonlight brightened the clearing, and the figure was gone. I got out of bed and stepped closer to the window. Nothing was there, just empty woods. I stood listening, my heart pounding harder than it should have. Then I heard slow movement behind the cabin, leaves crunching, footsteps, not fast, not sneaking, just pacing calmly along the back wall beneath the bedroom window. The sound stopped directly below me. I didn't move again for the rest of the night. The next morning, sunlight made everything feel less threatening, at least for a little while. The woods looked ordinary again. Birds moved through branches, fog lifted slowly from the ground, and the fear I'd felt during the night started to sound unreasonable in my own head. I walked around the cabin with a cup of coffee, trying to convince myself I'd overreacted. That lasted until I reached the back wall beneath the bedroom window. The leaves there looked pressed down in a wide patch, like someone had stood in the same spot for a long time. Near the foundation, deep in soft mud left from old rain, was a footprint, bare, human-shaped, larger than mine by several inches. The impression was clear enough to show individual toes. It didn't look old either. I crouched beside it longer than I should have, trying to explain it logically. Maybe a hunter had crossed through the property. Maybe someone local wandered the woods barefoot. Neither explanation felt believable. The clearing sat too far from any road, and there were no tire tracks besides mine. I spent most of the morning pacing between the porch and tree line, trying to decide whether to leave. But I'd already driven so far, and part of me didn't want to admit that a single strange night had scared me off. By afternoon, curiosity outweighed fear. Behind the cabin, past the patch of flattened leaves, I noticed a narrow trail disappearing into the trees. It looked old and barely used, partly hidden beneath roots and overgrowth. I grabbed a flashlight and followed it, telling myself I only planned to walk a short distance. The deeper I went, the more the woods changed. The air felt cooler under the thick canopy, and the silence became noticeable in a way that made me aware of every sound my body made. My breathing sounded too loud. Dry leaves cracked sharply beneath my shoes. After 10 minutes, I started seeing marks carved into trees along the path. 3 long vertical scratches cut close together. At first I thought hikers marked the trail, but these weren't painted symbols or trail signs. They looked gouged into bark with force. Some were fresh, exposing pale wood beneath. Others had darkened with age. The farther I walked, the more often I saw them. Eventually, the trail opened into a small clearing. In the center sat an old stone foundation covered in moss, the remains of what looked like a long, collapsed cabin. Pieces of rotten lumber lay scattered nearby. The place felt forgotten, untouched for decades. Hanging from a low branch above the foundation was a small child's shoe, swinging slightly in the breeze. The leather looked cracked and stiff with age. I felt an immediate urge to leave. Then I heard movement somewhere beyond the clearing. A quick rustle, something shifting through brush. I turned toward the sound and caught movement between trees, too large to be a raccoon and too upright to be a deer. I stood completely still, waiting for another sound, but everything went quiet again. As I backed away from the ruins, I noticed more prints in damp soil near the stones. Bare footprints, the same large shape as the one near the cabin. They led away from the clearing into thicker woods. I followed them with my eyes until they vanished beneath dead leaves. The walk back felt different. I kept glancing over my shoulder, sure I could hear something matching my pace just beyond sight. Every time I stopped, the woods stopped too. When the cabin finally came back into view through the trees, relief hit me harder than expected. But for the first time since arriving, the cabin didn't feel like a retreat anymore. It felt like a place sitting in the middle of someone else's territory. That evening, I kept replaying the trail in my head. The shoe hanging from the branch bothered me more than anything else. It wasn't just strange, it felt personal, like something intentionally left behind. I locked the cabin earlier than the night before and stayed inside, trying to distract myself with a downloaded movie. Outside, darkness settled quickly over the clearing. Around 10, I heard movement again. Not distant this time, leaves shifting near the side of the cabin, slow footsteps crossing gravel. I muted the television immediately. The sound stopped for several seconds, then resumed near the back wall. A scraping noise dragged across wood, slow enough that I could follow it, traveling along the exterior siding. I grabbed the fireplace poker and stood near the kitchen doorway, listening. The scraping ended near the bedroom side of the cabin. Then came 3 deliberate knocks against the wall. Not loud, controlled. I waited for more, but silence followed. I barely slept. The next morning I drove down the mountain under the excuse of needing groceries, though really I needed to be around people. The same gas station sat quiet beside the road. The woman behind the counter recognized me immediately. She studied my face before asking if I was staying at the cabin alone. I told her yes. I hesitated, then mentioned the footprints and the old ruins in the woods. For the first time, her expression changed. She glanced toward the windows as if checking who might be outside. She asked if I'd gone past the clearing behind the cabin. I told her I hadn't gone much farther than the stone foundation. She nodded slowly and lowered her voice. She said that area used to hold a small settlement decades ago, before a fire destroyed most of it. According to her, a family disappeared there sometime in the 1940s. Husband, wife, 2 kids. Search parties looked for weeks but never found bodies. She explained it casually, almost like repeating a local story she'd told before. When I asked if people believed someone killed them, she shrugged and said, "Mountain towns always created stories to explain things they didn't understand." But before I left, she stepped outside and stopped me beside my car. She said, "Don't stay out after dark up there." I asked why. She looked toward the mountains and said, "Some things notice routines." That sentence stayed with me the entire drive back. I reached the cabin before sunset and immediately noticed something wrong. The front porch railing had changed. Hanging from one of the wooden posts was a small animal skull tied with old string. It faced directly toward the front door. I stood there frozen, trying to remember if it had been there when I left that morning. I knew it hadn't. Beneath it, carved into the wood of the railing, were 3 vertical scratches. Fresh. Deep enough to expose pale splinters beneath weathered paint. I stepped inside and locked the door behind me. For the first time, I seriously considered leaving that night. But something about the skull bothered me in a different way than fear. It felt intentional, like whoever left it wanted me to notice, wanted me to understand that they'd been close enough to touch the porch while I was gone. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside made me sit up, listening for movement. Around dawn, I made up my mind to leave. I started packing slowly, folding clothes into my duffel bag while debating whether I was overreacting. But something kept pulling my attention back to the woods behind the cabin. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd only seen part of whatever was happening. Before driving away, I convinced myself to take one last walk down the trail. I told myself I needed closure, proof that there was a logical explanation for everything. I carried a flashlight, my phone, and a kitchen knife from the cabin drawer. The trail looked different that morning. Damp, quiet, heavy somehow. When I reached the stone foundation again, I noticed another path hidden behind thick brush near the edge of the clearing. It sloped downward into denser forest. The ground there looked disturbed, with patches of dirt exposed through dead leaves. I followed it carefully. The terrain became rougher, forcing me downhill through tangled roots and loose rock. After several minutes, I heard running water. A narrow creek cut through the bottom of a shallow valley. Across it rose a rocky hillside, partially covered by vines. That's when I noticed the opening. It blended into shadow at first, but once I crossed the creek, I realized it was a narrow cave entrance. The ground outside looked packed down from repeated use. Mud near the opening held multiple footprints pressed deep into the soil. Bare, large. Some looked fresh enough to still hold moisture. The smell hit me before I stepped inside. Rotting organic decay mixed with damp stone. I hesitated near the entrance, shining the flashlight into darkness. The cave narrowed quickly, forcing me to duck beneath low rock. Water dripped somewhere deeper inside. My light moved across the walls and landed on dozens of scratch marks carved into stone. 3 vertical lines repeated over and over, layered so densely that parts of the wall looked shredded. The farther I moved, the stronger the smell became. Then I saw bones. Small piles scattered along the cave floor. Animal remains mostly. Ribs, skull fragments, old vertebrae. Mixed among them were scraps of clothing buried beneath dirt. A faded blue sleeve. A child-sized sneaker half covered in mud. I felt my stomach drop. My first instinct was to turn around, but then I heard movement deeper in the cave. Slow scraping, something shifting against stone. I froze. The sound stopped immediately, like whatever made it knew I was listening. My flashlight shook as I aimed it farther down the tunnel. At first I saw nothing. Then a shape moved just beyond the beam. Tall, thin, standing still in darkness. I couldn't make out details, only the outline of long limbs and shoulders angled strangely. The figure didn't rush me. It simply stood there, motionless, watching. Then I heard breathing, slow and heavy, echoing faintly off stone walls. Panic took over. I backed away too quickly, slipping against loose rock before turning and running. Branches snapped somewhere behind me once I reached the trees. I didn't stop to look back. By the time I stumbled into the clearing near the cabin, my lungs burned and my legs felt weak. I locked myself inside and stared through the windows for nearly an hour. Nothing emerged from the woods, but I couldn't shake one terrifying realization. I had found where it stayed, and if it had been watching me before, now it knew I'd seen it. That final night felt completely different from the others. The cabin no longer felt temporary or unfamiliar. It felt unsafe in a way that was impossible to ignore. I packed everything before dark and left my bags beside the front door so I could leave quickly at sunrise. Rain started just after sunset, heavy enough to drum against the roof and blur the woods beyond the windows. The storm trapped me inside. Lightning flashed occasionally, showing the clearing in brief white bursts before darkness swallowed it again. I sat in the living room with the fireplace poker across my lap, listening to wind push through trees. Around 10, the power went out without warning. The television died. Lights disappeared, and the cabin fell silent except for rain and distant thunder. I lit 2 candles and stayed near the center of the room. That's when I heard footsteps on wet gravel outside. Slow, deliberate, moving toward the porch. My chest tightened instantly. The footsteps stopped near the front door. Several seconds passed. Then came 3 knocks. Calm, evenly spaced. I didn't move. The knocking returned, louder this time. Not aggressive, just patient. I backed away from the door as another sound followed, a scraping noise sliding across the front wall. Something moved around the cabin, dragging against wood. Lightning flashed through the windows, and for a single second, I saw a figure standing near the edge of the clearing, tall and pale against the rain, motionless, watching. The darkness returned before I could focus on details. I stayed frozen in the living room while footsteps circled the cabin again. The porch creaked once beneath heavy weight. Then everything went quiet. The silence lasted long enough that I thought maybe it had left. That's when I heard a voice outside the front door, soft, calm, my own voice. It said my name exactly the way I would say it, every muscle in my body locked. The voice repeated it, closer this time, followed by another 3 knocks. I couldn't breathe normally. Then the doorknob turned slowly. The lock rattled once, then harder. The entire door shook as something leaned against it. I backed into the kitchen and grabbed the knife. The pressure stopped. Silence returned for several seconds before a loud impact slammed into the side of the cabin, hard enough to shake the walls. Another hit followed from the backside. Then glass cracked in the bedroom. I turned just as the rear window shattered inward. Rain blew through the broken frame. For a second, I saw nothing except darkness. Then lightning flashed again. A pale hand gripped the edge of the window frame from outside. Long fingers curled around splintered wood. I didn't wait to see more. I ran straight through the front door into heavy rain and sprinted toward my car. Mud slid beneath my shoes as I fumbled for keys. Behind me, movement crashed through brush near the cabin. I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands. When the headlights illuminated the clearing, I saw it standing near the porch, thin, bare, too tall to look natural. Its posture looked wrong, shoulders hanging unevenly, head tilted slightly. The eyes reflected pale in the headlights. It didn't charge or move closer. It simply watched me. I backed out fast and drove down the mountain without stopping. I never returned. Months later, I searched online for the rental listing. It was gone. The owner's number no longer worked. I tried forgetting the entire experience, but some nights I still wake up to sounds outside my apartment. 3 slow knocks, never loud, never repeated more than once. I always tell myself it's neighbors or pipes or imagination. But every time I hear it, I remember the way that thing stood beside the cabin in the rain, not chasing me, not rushing, just waiting, like it already knew I'd carry it home with me.